Okay, good morning, folks. Folks who are sitting on the outside, please feel free to join the table. We have a few extra seats. I know others will be joining us shortly, but I just wanted to first say good morning, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many familiar faces. I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the gentleman sitting to my right and to my left, interestingly enough.
Isn't that name appropriate?
Senators Coons and Cramer, who we're going to hear from in just one moment. In the audience today, as you will see, we have representatives from industry, representatives from the environmental community, other think tanks, and we also have members of the press who we welcome to this conversation. So just a friendly reminder that this is an on-the-record conversation, and so you have been forewarned. But with that, let's turn to the topic of the day, which is the Providing Reliable, Objective, Verifiable Emissions Intensity and Transparency Act, or the Prove It Act, which I give everyone permission to use the acronym for the remainder of this event, the Prove It Act, which was introduced 3 months ago to the day, as I understand it. This Prove It Act represents the most comprehensive effort by the US government to accurately assess the carbon efficiency of dozens of industries across the world's largest economies. It is the council's view that this information, the information that would be generated from the study that DOE would be called upon to perform, would be a critical and important step in determining how we might leverage the United States' carbon advantage to the benefit of the global environment, US industry, and its workers. And so with that, I am again absolutely delighted to have joining us the sponsors of that legislation, Senators Chris Coons of Delaware and Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota. So Senator Cramer, I'm going to start with you. Why did you decide to sponsor this legislation? What are you hoping to achieve?
Well, you described it pretty well, both in the name and then in your brief introduction. Maybe to put even a finer point on it, it's really to, I think, for the government to validate the work of the CLC that the CLC has done in doing this very thing, in providing at least an initial baseline or some data that demonstrates America's exceptionalism in producing a lot of things that are carbon intensive. And then to use that data both as a trade tool, perhaps, to defend ourselves, in a trade negotiation or in a trade dispute, should it come to that. But I think as much as anything to identify with real data who the good guys are and who the violators are, if you will, and to sort of be able to call out with real information that's agreed upon, who the polluters are, and then fashion policy, geopolitical policy, especially around solid data that is verified and that is reconciled with others.
Senator Coons, I'm going to ask you a similar question, maybe from a slightly different angle. You have, in your time in the Senate, been a real climate champion. You have sponsored numerous pieces of legislation. You're co-chair of the Climate Caucus, bipartisan Climate Caucus in the Senate. Why did you decide to draft this legislation, and how do you see it in the context of your objective of lowering global greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, Greg, first I did this because any chance to legislate with Kevin Cramer is a chance to enjoy. So I noticed a significant editorial that he wrote with the former National Security Advisor, and I was really struck by its insightfulness, its analysis, its strategic thinking. Kevin and I had previously co-sponsored, we are co-sponsors of a bill in the affordable housing sector, and I thought this was a great chance for us to work together. One of the things I hear all the time back home in Delaware is, can't you guys work together? And so I love any opportunity to show thoughtful, balanced, serious legislation that's trying to solve real problems, and I'm so grateful to Senator Cramer for being my partner in this. And there are 7 other bipartisan co-sponsors. It's worth pointing out, this isn't just the 2 of us, it's the 2 of us and a whole raft of other senators from across different states. So first, the point, data matters. I trained as a chemist. I worked in industry for 8 years. And I think it's important that we have meaningful data. That's what manufacturing is based on. That's what innovation is based on. Second, I'll agree with Kevin that, American heavy industry is the cleanest or among the cleanest in the world, certainly cleaner than some of our major competitors, China, India, Russia, others. So if our steel and cement and glass and fertilizer and auto manufacturers are already among the lowest emissions in the world, and we are able to quantify the ways in which our heavy industries are among the cleanest in the world, and then take that data and hand it to our trade and energy and commerce agencies and have them use that as a tool as we look at the rest of the world, then we can provide trade advantages to American industry. We can protect or grow American jobs, and we can have a clearer and stronger foundation in which to have meaningful conversations, whether it's with partners and allies like the Canadians, Mexicans, the European Union, the UK, Norway. I mean, I've had conversations literally in all these places about this legislation. And at the end of the day, to pose a simple question, when we have debates at home and in the Congress about climate, one of the most common questions I get is, aren't you just disadvantaging American manufacturing with regards to the Chinese or Indians or Russians or others? And this is a way for us to begin figuring out how we're going to level the playing field and protect American manufacturing.
Well, that's a great segue into something I want to get into with you, Senator Cramer, which is, well, first coming back to the op-ed that you drafted about a year and a half ago with H.R. McMaster. And you have in that op-ed and several occasions afterwards called for some form of a fee on imports, but importantly, done in cooperation with allies and like-minded countries. At the same time, the European Union is moving forward with their CBAM, which you have been critical of. So my question to you is, did you have the EU's CBAM in mind at all as you thought through this legislation? And then my second question, if I can have two questions in this portion of the conference, is do you still see a role for cooperation ultimately long term?
Actually, I'm just an agent of the NRSC to try to take down Chris Coons and ruin his reputation. No. Yes, in a word. So a few things to that point. To just step back even one step further, I think one of the unfortunate things about where we are is that we didn't start sooner. That we weren't more. We weren't. I don't know if we weren't willing or we just hadn't thought of it or the right people hadn't come along. But I've always regretted that we weren't more in sync with the European Union at the beginning. But that's just not that's just not our culture or politics. For whatever reason, doesn't matter. We are where we are. So the fact that they've always been just a little bit out front is our fault, not theirs. At the same time, once we did get this process started, I did try to, and I worked closely, talked a lot. As you know, the Ukraine-Russian problem, conflict, war has precipitated a much closer relationship with our European allies for lots of obvious reasons. Again, there's nothing like a common enemy to remind us who our friends are. That said, energy has played and does play and will play, I think, an important role in that more important relationship. But even at that, I've been a little bit frustrated that the EU kept moving so fast forward when I was asking, and Chris was asking me, as he said he's talked to them a lot about this, wishing we could maybe reconcile a little better, a little sooner. But their CBAM starts with the premise that they tax themselves, and that is something we're clearly not prepared for. If anything, I think with this bill with Prove It Act, it's an incremental step to an increment, right? And so we're taking the baby steps. We're in the safe place for bipartisan discussions on this whole issue of climate. And they're further out. Do I still see an opportunity? Sure I do, because we still need each other. One thing the Prove It Act will do is if we start getting a border fee at Europe's borders, at the countries' borders, we can hold this up and say, hey, listen, a price is not the only metric. It's not the only metric. There are other metrics, and here's what we've done, and plead our case. Beyond that, if it's too late to roll back what they've done to themselves, is interesting. And I think I can share this. I had the German ambassador was in my office, and as you might recall, Germany was one of the countries, really the outlier in their effort. So they let's do this incrementally, sort of like what we're doing. Had they done that, had that prevailed, we'd be more reconciled. That said, the horse out of the barn, and they're saying, gee, won't you really be disadvantaging us because we have this additional domestic tax? Well, yeah, but that's not my fault or my problem. I'm sorry we didn't do this together, but so we still have some tension at this point. But it's tension among friends. It's people that have a tension about solving a problem as opposed to fighting with one another. So I remain, eternally optimistic, but so I'm hopeful that there's still a future for all of us.
I'm hopeful too.
So Senator Coons, let's stay on the international front. You already mentioned China. They obviously register very big in this conversation that we're having. To date, our country's approach with China on climate has, for the most part, been one in which we've tried to find cooperation, Paris Accord and other allies. My opinion that I'll just share, often commitments or actions haven't lived up to commitments. Do you view this as the Prove It Act and some of the other legislation that you've explored using trade as a tool? Do you view this as a different approach for motivating action in China and around the rest of the world?
So here, just a general statement. Superficially, just my read on where we are is that we have no meaningful mechanism right now to restrain the growth in emissions in China and India. And everything we do, let's imagine that the United States, the European Union, and all of our allied open market democratic countries, everything we do to reduce emissions will be swamped by the growth in Chinese and Indian emissions in the current models. And so it's an understandable criticism to say, why are you restraining our industry when they're building a record number of coal-fired power plants? No amount of sitting across the table in Paris or Dubai or and talking nicely to each other, I think, is going to change the conduct of the PRC in this. What will is if their exports are harmed in the most important global markets. And that only happens when there's alignment between the three North American countries of USMCA, which the previous administration got done and signed into law. So you've got Canada, the United States, Mexico. That's a pretty big common market. And then the EU, UK. If you added Japan, Australia, if all of those countries had a common emissions intensity standard, and suddenly Chinese dirty steel and cement and aluminum and couldn't get into those markets on a competitive basis, they'd have a very strong incentive to start producing low emissions, heavy industrial products. In fact, I can't think of another mechanism that's likely to work. And this fits with American free market principles. It says, how are we going to get the Chinese and the Indians to begin restraining their growth in emissions? By saying, you want access to our market? Fine. And if you talk to steel workers, and that's one of the largest building trades in my state is steel workers at our oil refinery, they're sick to death of how cheap Chinese steel has destroyed the steelmaking industry in the United States. And what's left is very low emissions. And they keep looking at us saying, when are you guys going to actually protect us from the dirty steel that's coming into this country from Russia, from China, from India? Here's your answer. And so there's a lot of different ways this works. If all you really care about is reducing global emissions, this is a path that I think can work. If what you care about is protecting American jobs, this is a path that I think works. If you're the most pro-union president in American history, who's that guy? This is something that works. If you're the former president and the leading candidate in the other party, he imposed tariffs on China. This is a way to do it, not in opposition to our closest allies, but in partnership with our closest allies. What's not to like? This is a path forward that all of us could get around. And so I'm actually really optimistic and grateful that we're talking about how do you get all the relevant federal agencies coordinated, DOE in the leadership, but obviously also EPA, also USTR, also Commerce. There's lots of different sources of data. Yeah. But if we're sitting across the table in Brussels with the EU having fights about the CBAM, and we don't have data and we don't have an approach. We're just having the next stage of what has been an unfortunate decades-long tariff war with Europe, where they say, well, we're now imposing tariffs on American products coming into the EU. And we say, oh, well, the heck with you. How's that a nice way to put it? We already have tension over the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a way for us to have something that both can give a little bit on and harmonize, as Senator Cramer.
I would just add, first of all, Chris is so eloquent on this topic, and he's also a global guy.
Chris Coons, global guy.
I would add to that the dynamism of the relationships that who knows where it leads. We've struggled in terms of trading with some of our most like-minded friends, and in other areas, food included. I come from a big agriculture state, obviously, so I just think the moment is right. The geopolitical moment is right to do this and to make meaningful reforms globally to emissions, but at the same time, do trade with people that we should have been doing more trade with people we should have been doing a lot more trade with for a long, long time, and as well as impacting change, among polluting countries. So I'm really not an agent of the NRSC.
I want to stay on something that Senator Coons said just a minute ago, which is the importance of good data. And I want to come back to you, Senator Cramer. The reality is we have a very robust greenhouse gas emissions reporting system in the United States. We know our data pretty well. And this is going to be a leading question. I apologize. Is this exploration, is the study that you're calling for, as much as anything, about better understanding how the US compares to other countries, meaning having a better opinion about what the rest of the world's emissions profile looks like, what the rest of the world's emissions intensity looks like?
So to Chris's point of this everything lines up politically. Good data that demonstrates that is obviously important to a lot of my people. I mean, let's face it, we're living in the Republican Party, we're living in this America First populism, explosion, really. And so this helps that. This speaks to that. So yes, that's a big part of it, is identifying the big polluters and reconciling the fact that the big polluters also happen to be our adversaries in the case of China. In the case of India, not so much. In the case of India, you're talking about a big polluter, big economy, friendly largely, still looking for who their best friend in the neighborhood is. We screw that up from time to time as a country. And this is why in addition to having good data that's reconcilable, or at least convincing, both to our own constituents, but then to our trading partners as well as our trade competitors, is important, but so is being at the table. I mean, all the data in the world doesn't do you any good if you're not at the table. And the funny thing about global tables, when the United States is at the table, we're always at the head of the table. And so again, good data is a tool, as Chris pointed out, and tools are so much better than weapons. And I just think it's a grand moment. But yes, largely to your question, but it's even more than that.
And so a broader set of use cases than even what we've been talking about today. We were talking about trade as a possible tool, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there are other use cases for this data than simply the policies that we've already touched on today.
Again, data is a really great tool. Obviously, trade's a really great tool, and it's far better tool than a weapon if you can avoid using the weapon. And I think, to Chris's point, let's face it, what are we, 5% of the world's population, 20% of the world's economy? I mean, we are consumers. We will, I think, always be consumers. That is the leverage we've always had, particularly with big producing countries like China. They don't want to lose that. I sometimes think we understate our value as consumers to the rest of the world. We just can't then disadvantage our own producers as the number one consumers, and we shouldn't. You shouldn't.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Senator Coons, you mentioned your opening, and I neglected to mention that you do have a nice group of bipartisan co-sponsors on this legislation.
It's the mean ones we're missing.
And really broad set of endorsers of this bill. climate organizations, industry groups. We're going to hear from the Chamber of Commerce and Steel Association and Solar Alliance in just a little bit. I mean, it may be a question for both of you. What do you attribute about this particular topic, what you're exploring in the Prove It Act, that has generated such broad support? What is it about this topic that appeals to both sides?
I think it makes sense. I mean, I think this is a path forward that allows folks whose principal frame in politics is pro-free trade, pro-market economy, America first, to kind of look at this and say, this is a way to protect and reward American manufacturing. This is a way to impose costs on some of our greatest adversaries and opponents. And if you're a global guy and an internationalist and someone who cares about climate and science, I'm just trying to figure out how you make these two opposites, because they're really not at the end of the day. It also makes sense for you. Look, I'm from a state where when I was growing up, we had 2 auto plants and a steel mill and an oil refinery. 3 out of 4 of them are gone. And all the communities that lived up the hill from the steel mill, including one Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., whose childhood home was walking distance from the steel mill, are still living with the echoes of tens of thousands of high-skilled, high-wage manufacturing jobs going away. The GM plant that I grew up going past, and lots of the kids I grew up going to school with, their dads worked in the auto factory. It's an Amazon warehouse now, which is great, but the robots are making $20 an hour. And I mean, it's a 4 million square foot facility employing a handful of people at $25 an hour, where there used to be a facility with 5,000 guys making $60 an hour. And that just, the social impact of that in our country, we still haven't wrestled with it. I view this as a way to further strengthen and defend the manufacturing that we have, which has been gaining. There have been 800,000 manufacturing jobs created in the last 2 years. I worked in manufacturing. I believe deeply in it as the sector that has the greatest secondary benefit to our country. We are consumers, but in my gut, I just don't think we can be a world leader if we don't make things. If we don't invent things, make things, and export things. And so it's great to grow chickens and sell them overseas. It's great to grow beef and sell it overseas. It's great to raise corn and soybeans. But at the end of the day, something in my rat brain says, if we're not making stuff, if my kids grow up only driving Chinese cars and there's no cars made in the United States, if there's no furniture made in the United States, if there's no, if we don't have the raw building materials in this country, then I don't see that we have a bright future. Second, innovation is at the core of who we've always been. Inventing solutions to problems is who we've always been. In the end, in that discussion that Kevin was just talking about between an adversary, China, and a friend who would really like to be a partner and an ally, India, part of that solution is our innovating solutions to emissions reduction and sharing them closely with the countries who we most want to be our partners. And I think this also opens the door to that by having real data and then being able to partner with countries. Let's imagine Mexico decides they really want in. They want to do more of the heavy industry that provides solutions for the American marketplace. They've already got the trade relationship with us. They've got the logistics and the proximity. We can and should provide the innovative solutions for how to further reduce emissions in everything from the solar industry to the steel industry.
So, Senator Cramer, what are you hearing from your Republican colleagues you're speaking to? I should have mentioned in the sort of the sort of who's been involved in this broader conversation, Bob Lighthizer, USTR for former President Trump. How have the conversations been going with Republicans? What's the response been?
Well, Republicans, and this gets to my point of incrementalism and Prove It being the safest space among the safe spaces. Because I actually think CBAM, by the way, I've been accused multiple times now in letters to the editor saying this is just a front for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. See, we told you so. I'm like, yeah, I started there actually. Anyway, so that's good, but that's fine with me. How are they going? So Republicans have been approaching me, and I approached them. They're curious, and anybody that's honestly intellectually curious about this is gettable. Now, let's face it, we live in a political environment. We all have, seems we all are challenged in primaries. And so we don't want to ignore the politics of it. But this, if you're prepared and willing to explain it, this is one of the easiest things for Republicans to explain. So they're very open to it. I would say at this point, you know, if we had a straight up or down vote tomorrow on prove it, you know, I'd have to scramble, you know, but that's not been our goal. Our goal has been to, again, to work it deliberately, slowly, make people comfortable with it. And I'm quite confident we could get there fairly soon if we needed to. The bigger challenge, I think the bigger question becomes, what about Republicans in the House? And a much more emotional place to work. I spent 6 years there. I always used to say, if I could just convince the members from South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska to be with me, I'd have 5 votes, and I'd only be 212 away. You know, but so it's a bigger challenge over there. I think, but at the same time, this is where you mentioned Bob Lighthizer, but an America First message resonates more. And he has to start with the data. So I'm comfortable with where we are. They're not knocking the door down to get on board, but they are very curious, and people have been genuinely supportive of the concept.
And there is, Greg, if I'm not mistaken, a bipartisan introduction in the House soon. So there will be a House introduced version of this. I also think our critical next step, and this is in Kevin's court, is on the EPW committee to which it's been referred, which is chaired by some close friend of mine from Delaware, the senior senator. So if we could get it on the agenda on the committee and move it out of committee, as we all know, to take an idea and get it to the president's desk can take years. But from introduction to growing out bill sponsors, to growing out endorsements, to getting it marked up in committee, that's some important steps.
And Chris brings up an important point, because being on EPW with Tom and Shelley, it's a very good committee. First of all, it surprised me when I got assigned to EPW. I don't know about you, but that was not I didn't envision that happening. I'm delighted, but I didn't envision it. You are talking about, in the case of Shelley and Tom, 2 really good leaders, and with regard to the committee, talking about a committee that passed out the highway bill unanimously, and then WRDA unanimously before the bipartisan infrastructure bill got put together. So pretty collaborative, as I was quoted yesterday. I don't know if the reporters in the room that quoted me yesterday. We're a pretty collaborative group of egomaniacs. So it works pretty well.
So we're getting close to our time. We're trying to do one sort of quick question, and then I'm going to ask you guys to bring us home with an optimistic note. So the quick question is for folks in the room who are interested in Prove It Act, who are interested in helping, what would be helpful? How can folks who want to be supportive of your effort?
Well, I'd start with please talk to your Republican member friends, your Republican senator friends, and get them comfortable with the concept. And if necessary, assure them that maybe it doesn't ever lead to a CBAM, but it might prevent one from being used against us. And then hopefully we warm them up to other things. That would be the best thing you can do if you can do anything. Talk to Republican senators and pave the way, make them comfortable, push them over the edge, depending on where they are in the discussion.
Murkowski, Graham, and Cassidy are already co-sponsors. Just you can say thank you and encourage them.
Yeah, right.
But I couldn't agree more. Look, having Shelley Moore Capito and Tom Carper hear from folks that this is a bill that you support, that you understand, that you think has value, that having the Department of Energy lead an effort with EPA, with Commerce, with USTR, with others, strikes you as sensible. Having a broader range of endorsing organizations helps. A broad range of industry and advocacy organizations helps. So, frankly, and if I'm not mistaken, the score is either low or nothing.
It's like 0, yeah.
So something that has a relatively small score is also very helpful in Congress. I think there is no time for us to wait and delay and think. I think we need to keep moving this forward, because it's the gateway towards doing the serious work. Those of us who spend a lot of time on climate, and those of us who are superficial and ill-informed on climate, myself, know that the heavy industrial sector is the hardest to decarbonize. We've got now huge incentives for the production of hydrogen in the United States and in Europe for different reasons and with different mechanisms. But this is a sector where there are some real innovations happening in cement, in steel, in glass. And I'm confident that if we move forward on this and we continue to invest in the private sector and the public sector in innovation, and we link arms with our allies, that there's a real path forward here, and a path forward that leads to communities all over the United States having better, stronger, more secure jobs in some of the foundational economies of our future. So I'm really optimistic about it. I'm really grateful to you, to the CLC, and in particular to Senator Cramer. And for those who find the politics of Washington at the moment lead you to despair, just go tell folks that this is a morning that began with two senators, a Democrat and a Republican, saying genuinely nice things about each other, except for the NRSC thing. But I'm not up until 2026.
I mean, I don't think you're an agent of the DSC, are you?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right, well, I think that is a perfect note to end on. Senator Coons, Senator Cramer, thank you so much for joining us. But more importantly, thank you for your willingness to work together to find common ground. We know this is not always an easy topic, but I think you have found a space that is both sensible and ultimately productive towards all of the goals that we want to accomplish. So please join me in thanking Senator Cramer, Senator Coons.
Chris, see you at the factory.
Okay, as the senators make their way back to the Hill, I am pleased to welcome our next panel, which will be led by my colleague, Katrina Rourke, who will introduce the other speakers.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Good seeing you. Yeah. Yes.
All right, there are still seats at the table. Nobody on this panel fights, so if you want to come forward. And the great shuffle, now's a good time. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. A lot of folks in this room are already deeply invested in the Prove It Act. For those of you who aren't, I hope hearing from industry can help push you over the edge. Come on in. Let me introduce my colleagues here on this panel. I'm going to start at the end. Michael Parr, Executive Director of the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance. That's a coalition of solar manufacturing companies that are dedicated to decarbonizing solar supply chains and delivering really low carbon product for the solar installation. Michael has decades of experience in energy sustainability and carbon mitigation issues in the manufacturing sector. Philip Bell, President of the Steel Manufacturers Association. That's the largest steel industry association in North America. He represents some of the largest, cleanest steel manufacturers in the world. He has deep roots in the steel industry, and he's focused on international trade issues throughout his career. And then Marty Durbin, President of the Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He leads the Institute's efforts to build support for common sense energy solutions and policy change. He's worked with industry partners across energy and manufacturing, including oil, gas, chemicals, and plastics. You can see we've got broad representation here. Let's dig in. We heard from the senators what we think we'll see if the Prove It Act comes to fruition in the data that the DOE will collect and publish, which is that the United States, especially in the manufacturing industry, will have much fewer carbon emissions than many of our international competitors. And so if the US is already a world leader in carbon efficient manufacturing, excuse me, can you talk about how the carbon advantage presents opportunities for the American companies that you work with? Why don't we start with you?
So in many ways, the solar industry is a really good example of all the themes that we heard the two senators talk about. It is a surprisingly energy intensive industry and component of it, particularly far upstream when you're looking at polysilicon and silicon wafers. A single polysilicon plant in Michigan consumes more energy, in fact, than the next 10 industrial entities in Michigan combined. If you think about Michigan, that's a lot of industry. So quite energy intensive. And so where and how you make it has a big carbon influence. In fact, as solar manufacturing has grown predominantly in China in the last decade or so, the carbon footprint of a given solar panel made in China is double that of one made in the US or the EU. And estimates are on the order of, if all the growth in solar manufacturing the next 10 years occurs in China rather than the US, that's up to an additional 20 billion tons of carbon emissions, a good half of which are avoidable. That's a pretty significant bogey. We are already seeing, because many of the solar buyers have scope 3 carbon emissions, they have strong ESG goals, already a growing recognition of the perils of high carbon solar, which also happens to overlap with forced labor in the solar supply chain in Xinjiang, China, and a move towards seeking more sustainable products. Result of that, what's growing rapidly in the US? Solar manufacturing, because buyers are seeking better alternatives. How do you inform those decisions? How do you give them the numbers that let them make the business decisions to buy better solar is always a critical issue. Having government imprimatur on those numbers to allow company boards to say, got it, this makes a whole lot of sense, let's move to US suppliers, is a very useful tool in helping drive that transition faster.
Thanks, Katrina. And I want to thank you and Greg and CLC for putting this forum together. It's really great. I think when we look at what's going on right now, we have some very interesting opportunities in front of us. And what excites us the most at SMA about the Prove It Act is it actually confirms some work that the CLC did 3 years ago, where in conjunction with CRU, you guys looked at the emissions intensity of the domestic steel industry. And what your study reported was that steel produced in America is anywhere from 75% to 320% less carbon intensive than steel produced in other regions of the world. And I think with the transparency and the data reporting that we're going to have with the Prove It Act, that's just another thing that can go together with what's going on at USTR, ITC, and the EPA, as well as the Department of Energy, to kind of show and confirm that we are the leaders. When it comes to the steel industry, we have a steel industry in America that other countries are aspiring to be like. Every steel producer in this country already has emission levels that are at or below the Paris Climate Accord. Every steel maker in this country produces steel with an increasingly cleaner energy grid and uses renewable energy such as solar and hydro and wind and biomass to power their plants. So we're in a very unique position and very glad to assume the leadership role that I think the United States should assume when it comes to creating a lower carbon future, not only for the steel industry, but for manufacturing and for the world in general.
Well, thank you as well, Katrina and Greg, for inviting me to be part of this and for bringing everybody together and having the senators join us. So it was just a great setup for the issue we're addressing here. And let me clear out, in addition to my role as Global Energy Institute, I'm Senior Vice President of Policy and oversee all of our climate sustainability work across the Chamber of Commerce. So it's all of our members. And I will tell you, this was a no-brainer. Didn't take any discussion to be able to say, should we endorse the bill that Senator Coons and Senator Cramer put together? In fairness, as Phil was saying, I think the report, Katrina, that you and Greg and CLC did, Carbon Advantage, really helped to set the foundation for establishing the advantage that the U.S. has across the board, not just with whether we're talking about China or developing countries, but with Europe and some of our developing partners. And I think what's clear is that advantage that we have today is only poised to grow further. our electricity sector, the power sector is only going to get cleaner. If you look at the commitments that have been made from the electricity sector and where policy is driving that, it's only going to get cleaner from where it is today. In manufacturing, our industrial base, it is already, compares well across the world, but it too, building in a way that is going to be even more efficient and reducing emissions even further. And then also just the natural gas sector that we have here in the U.S. that has helped to drive down emissions in the power sector, but it's critical to driving both power and industrial the industrial sector of our country. And that sector too has embarked on and is engaged in really reducing emissions across their value chain. So again, the advantages are only going to grow here. So in the context of things like the EU CBAM, we just look at the cleaner U.S. exporters they've got an opportunity to expand our markets even further. So to wrap up, I thought the senators put it really well as far as what this addresses is those long-term goals we all need to be focused on. What the outcome we want at the end of the day is, cleaner industry, lower emissions, maintaining and growing the competitiveness of U.S. companies. The data that we'll get from this exercise is going to help us get there.
Thanks, Marty. Each of you has hinted at this this concept that we refer to as like the level playing field. And American manufacturers are not on a level playing field. We see here considerable investment in decarbonization, in industrial efficiency, in these innovative approaches to manufacturing. And those are all capital intensive investments. Those require companies to be forward looking, plan for the future, but they're doing that in a marketplace where they're competing, especially on the international stage, with companies who are not similarly forward looking, who are not similarly making investments in decarbonization. And so one of the things that the Prove It Act brings to mind for me is pointing out how unlevel the playing field is, but also in bringing forward this opportunity to go somewhere from there, right? So once we know the asymmetries in carbon efficiencies across these industries internationally, that might create more opportunity. And so how do you think that greater data transparency can generate a market for goods that are more efficient, can support decarbonization efforts internationally, can inform changes to the policy landscape to lock in incentives that these capital intensive investments in decarbonizing are worth it? Whoever wants to go.
So the story of solar manufacturing is the story of manufacturing writ large for America of the last couple of decades, where we were once the predominant producer, and then China woke up one morning and said, solar, that looks good, let's do solar. And the level of investment and subsidization meant that they grew at a rate that was almost unimaginable. And single investments, they would build a plant that was larger than all of the installed capacity in the US. And then they build another and another and another. Some of that brought good. The scale of manufacturing drove down the cost of solar dramatically by 90% in the course of a decade, which was good because that made solar more accessible to the market. But with that came some intended things like making it unprofitable to manufacture solar anywhere else in the world. So all the growth occurred in China. So 80 to 98% of each step in the supply chain is now concentrated in China. Not a great risk management picture. But it also came with these unintended consequences, high carbon, forced labor, and other things. One of the really interesting things about using carbon as a trade mediation tool is we are a big solar market in America. The EU is a big solar market. Chinese companies want to sell here because they built an export-oriented solar industry. Even though they're deploying a lot at home, they want to sell into here. which is why you see every time we have a trade action, they do something to try to evade it and set up some sort of assembly in Southeast Asia, ship their Chinese components over, and then say, hey, see, it's a Vietnamese solar module. Let us send it to America. If we make the price of admission to the market lower carbon manufacturing, you know what they'll do? They will lower the carbon intensity of their manufacturing. And that's a good thing to the world at large. And you know who's trying to become the next really big solar manufacturer in the world? Our friends in India. They have a massive program to build an end-to-end solar industry from polysilicon right through to module assembly. And the other thing about India, its grid is even dirtier than China. And so if we aren't careful, we trade one high carbon, low cost production center for another. Not a great thing for the world at large, and particularly ironic in clean energy, right? And so using carbon as the metric signals to all producers, I don't care where you are, if you want to continue to export to the US and its allied nations, critical, you ought to grow differently. And maybe that nascent Indian industry should start with a perspective on decarbonization. And I will tell you, my conversations with Chinese industry, they're fascinated by what we're doing, and they're fascinated by the eco-label, low carbon eco-label we created for solar. And I've had the head of a major Indian association say, this is how we should grow our industry. So they're already interested, and nothing like the hurdle of you got to be low carbon to get in to change the way people think about how they build their industry.
To piggyback on what Michael said, I think it's very important to note that the American steel industry between 2022 and 2025 will have invested over $20 billion of its own money to create about 18 million tons of new steel making capacity that's going to modernize, electrify, and decarbonize our steel industry. It's going to make an already cleaner, already more competitive industry even cleaner and more competitive. And I think it's important to understand how the Prove It Act can even help further. There's been landmark legislation, the IRA, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that have all helped in two ways. One, it's put money out there for companies to pursue more sustainable manufacturing and lower carbon emissions manufacturing. It's also created a lot of demand for steel. At the SMA, we like to say that steel is the solution for the solution providers. You have steel in solar panels, you have steel in wind turbines, you have steel in hydro projects, you have steel in pipelines that move natural gas and also soon to move hydrogen and create hydrogen hubs and storage facilities. So we are very pleased with what the legislation has done, but with clear, transparent data, hopefully we can do more. As I mentioned in my earlier statement, many regions of the world are trying to make their steel industry look like ours. One of the reasons we are the cleanest is over 70% of the steel produced in this country is produced via a process called the electric furnace, which basically uses recycled steel as its raw material. So you get a dual benefit on sustainability there. And then it uses electricity from a grid that's getting cleaner and cleaner every year to power their plants. You throw in some renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydro, and our steel is just going to continue to be the cleanest in the world. But here's the difference. While companies like Nucor, US Steel, Commercial Metals, Steel Dynamics are spending their own money to do it, companies in Europe are getting direct subsidies to convert to EAF steel production. That's where the playing field gets very unlevel. And hopefully we can talk with our European counterparts as well as Canadian and other counterparts about these direct subsidies, because I think it's clearly important to understand we're doing this through the private sector. The IRA is not a subsidy program. It's a program that's available to all industries interested in improving their carbon footprint. I'll also agree with Michael 100% here. In order to really make our environment cleaner, you have to have a subjective measure. And that's why carbon emissions is the important thing. You don't want to be aspirational. You want to deal with attainment. And I think when you look at carbon emissions levels, you can clearly focus on actual attainment as opposed to aspirations and mission statements.
Well, I will piggyback a little on Philip's comments as well. And in addition to the three laws you mentioned, I'll go back one Congress further and talk about, the Energy Act of 2020 that did so much. And by the way, for those that remember, completely bipartisan bill. It was probably one of the last times we saw what we could all refer to as regular order within the Energy Committee and the Senate, which was not a surprise. Another good committee. But dozens of provisions that all had bipartisan support that focused on the need for the federal government to incentivize the types of innovation technology we're going to need to meet all of these mission goals. So then that leads to things like what Philip was talking about, the $25 billion of investments from the industry to improve. And they're improving to meet the expectations of the global market that is out there. So while I agree with Senator Cramer about, wish we didn't have, the EU going off this direction and, where are we in this? And what about our other allies? I think there's a better way to approach that, which we may get to later. I will say that, if you just kind of look at the EU process, not only does it incentivize, cleaner products and cleaner production, it incentivizes you not only being cleaner, but proving that you're cleaner. So having something like the Prove It Act that says, here's the data, now, puts individual companies in more of an ability to say, here's what we're doing. One analog that's out there right now is that the U.S. Department of Energy is working with Japan, Korea, even the EU on establishing a framework for differentiated natural gas. Again, the idea being, can we come up with a way of measuring and being able to say gas was produced in a sustainable, clean fashion? And so, I think that provides real opportunities, for the industry, more broadly. But it's really been kind of a no-brainer when you think about policy drivers that are out there need some type of measurement tools to be able to succeed. So, that to transparency and precision that we will get from, the data we're going to hear is going to help us continue to take to leverage the advantage that the U.S. has.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, I want to build on that last comment. Okay, so we have a carbon advantage. We have it in the United States, even in these hard to decarbonize manufacturing sectors. How can we leverage that advantage? Growth for U.S. businesses as they achieve sustainability? Like what is how do we connect those policy dots, right? You've mentioned policy that we've implemented in the past. We want a better data foundation to make that sort of next step in productive policy making. What do you think that looks like?
Well, in some ways, it's as simple as the old adage that the customer is always right. The global markets, the expectations of the global markets are changing and evolving, just as we've seen, here in the U.S. When you look at, you go back 10 years, there was a smaller portion of manufacturing companies that were really focused on these issues. But now, as we know, every company is getting the pressure from investors and shareholders, their own workforce, the supply chain, and then policymakers. So the incentives are out there to drive yourself because it's market driven. So it provides that opportunity to leverage our opportunity. I was just looking back at the IRA and recognizing that the IRA was as much about industrial policy and reshoring policy as it was climate policy. Again, provides additional opportunities there to think about if we can both leverage our carbon advantage and spur domestic manufacturing. And as I you know, whether it's reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, however that ends up coming to be. But those are the advantages we can leverage. They said to both have, you know, cleaner production that serves a global market while spurring our own manufacturing here in the U.S.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So, Phil, Senator Coons invoked a concern that he hears a lot from the steel industry. When are you going to step in and actually protect an industry that's making all these investments, that has decarbonized substantially from international competition that has not? And so I was hoping that you could talk about how this data precision, data transparency could enhance sustainability in the US steel industry, but also amongst international competition.
Yeah, that's a great question, Katrina. I think what's important here is we need something that can bring this loose confederation of reporting tools together. I think Greg talked about how there's already a pretty robust reporting mechanism. For the steel industry, we report our emissions to the EPA through the EPA flight tool. Every year, every steel company that operates a furnace and creates emissions sends that data to the EPA. But on top of that, recently, USTR Ambassador Catherine Tai requested that the International Trade Commission conduct a study to find out the embodied carbon emissions on the 54 product categories that were subject to 232 tariffs. So here's another request for data that we have. And we don't mind doing it. It's very similar to what we report to the EPA, but yet that's another request. So what happens also is whenever you are looking at various global standards for decarbonization, there's about 50 of them out there. There's about 4 or 5 that have percolated to the top, like the Global Steel Climate Council, Responsible Steel, First Movers. That's another thing you have to report. So by having this legislation and kind of having something that can pull all of this together, I think is absolutely critical. I think it's also important to know that our members are not only investing in a lower carbon future, but they're marketing lower carbon products. And this gets to what Marty talked about when he said the customer is always right. It's the customer, it's the shareholders, it's your employees that want to work somewhere where they're making products that are helping make our environment greener. And I'm going to give you 3 very concrete examples. There's a company called Commercial Metals Company, headquartered in Irving, Texas, that makes a product called Rebar Zero. Rebar is short for reinforcing steel that's used in every major construction project in this country, particularly if it involves concrete. The reason that they can make net zero rebar is, one, because of their production process, electricity, recycled steel as their raw material, but also they're using renewable energy credits. They're using solar panels to power their mills. In some cases, they're using hydro, and they're also looking at their Scope 3 emissions and making sure that their transportation and logistics networks reduce the distance where they have to ship the steel. So a great example of how they're doing that. Nucor has a new line of sustainable steel called Econique. And what this steel does is it basically certifies as being net zero because of some of the similar strategies that Commercial Metals is doing. And then SSAB Americas, with their facility in Montpelier, Iowa, is producing fossil-free steel. SSAB makes plate, which is used in infrastructure and heavy equipment. So having data that's readily available, published, communicated, maybe even serves as a clearinghouse for all of these other initiatives, I think would be very valuable to our industry. Yeah.
Michael, I've heard you say before, not all solar is created equal, a theme that you've brought up again and again, but okay, we need a lot of solar to go on this energy transition to decarbonize our economy in the United States, but also decarbonize and develop emerging economies internationally. It does seem important that the solar we install has the lowest footprint possible. Can you unpack this dynamic a little bit? You've mentioned that conventional solar has about twice the footprint. How are ultra low carbon solar companies getting this advantage, this carbon advantage in manufacturing?
So a lot of it will sound familiar from what Phil has said, is that we have been pretty effective at decarbonizing the US grid. Europe even more so. And in fairness, China has not stood still, but moved more slowly and started from a much higher carbon intensity. So there's an inherent benefit to manufacturing in the US just because the grid's better. But also, our market structure is such that if you're making solar in China, and as someone who actually did a plant in China many decades ago when I was in manufacturing business, they build a building for you, they give you free power essentially. Hey, no taxes for the long. Why don't you move the equipment? In fact, we'll move the equipment in for you, make it solar panels. Pretty attractive, allows you to make stuff that's really, really, really cheap. Is it fairly priced? No, of course it's not. But it also means that you don't have a whole lot of motivation for energy efficiency or other things to improve the business because your margin's pretty good because someone else is paying most of the bills. Here in the US, energy is a really large component of solar manufacturing, just as it is for steel. So you have every motivation in the world to run as energy efficient an operation as you possibly can, both in just normal energy efficiency, whether it's running the plant more on the weekends when you can maximize renewables load, whether it's using cogeneration, whether it's improving your technologies. There's a polysilicon plant out in West Coast that actually uses a fluidized bed reactor technology that's a good 30% lower energy consumption per unit of production just because of the technology. And so there's lots of business motivation to operate more cleanly here. And as we are educating the market and as people are becoming more aware, and as some of the leading kind of more ESG-oriented solar developers understand this and preferentially seek to buy low carbon solar, that's a further signal to US producers. Hey, I want to do business with LightSource BP. How do I shave a few more grams per kilowatt peak out of this module? Because they're interested in that, and I'm helping them with their scope 3. We can take that same dynamic and make it a global dynamic pretty simply. And one of the things I love about the idea of a carbon level informed trade policy is all of us have worked in policy for a long time, and we know that US, we tend to like mandates and regulations, and they are cumbersome, they are slow to implement, they have gobs of loopholes, they're pretty inefficient to implement because they cost everybody a whole lot of money for what you get. These market-driven responses from something as simple as a carbon basis, markets move fast, markets move efficiently. Stuff happens really quickly when you say, I don't care how you do it. I don't really care how you do it, but you got to be below this if you want to sell in. And further below you are, the more people probably pay for that product, all of a sudden stuff happens in the market. So the efficiency of a market signal from a policy like this is very attractive as well. And the last thing I would note, we've all talked about the IRA and the other incentive policies. That's going to last 10 years. People are every single one of my members is putting steel in the ground in America. Mostly American steel. A lot of them are partnering with Phil's members because they want the low carbon steel in their products because they see market value for it. 10 years from now, they're going to be exposed to the full brunt of Chinese industry if that's all we do. And China right now, they built so much solar manufacturing capacity, minimum 50% over capacity, meaning they can make 50% more than the market wants any given year. So half of their stuff is unprofitable anyway, but this is just the model. The government gives you money to build, and that suppresses the price, and that makes it really hard to build something competitive elsewhere. What I don't want to see happen is all of the hard work from my members, all that capital, 10 years from now, they go, well, that was fun, but now I'm unprofitable. I don't want to have to continue to extend the IRA to make this work. What I want to see is we build a good, strong, competitive, low carbon manufacturing sector in solar here, and we implement the balancing effect of carbon as a metric. And then they can compete head to head. And if any given American producer can't compete with an offshore producer with the same carbon footprint, so be it. That's on you. But that creates a much more sustainable environment, which all of the hard work we've done under the IRA isn't just a short-term thing that then some high carbon competitor can overwhelm in the future.
Yeah, so interesting. Power policy. We've talked a lot about competition. I want to move to talk about cooperation, but I also want to open up for questions from the audience. So think while we speak. So yes, the US has a carbon advantage. Yes, we should get better data to understand it. Yes, American manufacturers should win the day. Also, trade cooperation is really important to make sure that American companies win the day. How do you see this data transparency, the potential for policy change in the future, like the senators were talking about with climate clubs, border fees, any kind of policy change? How can this data sort of lay the foundation for closer trade cooperation with the countries that we most want to trade with the markets that we most want access to? How do you see this supporting trade cooperation?
Well, if you'll indulge me for a moment before I move to trade, one of the points that we've all talked about, IRA, CHIPS Act, I do just want to say, well, those are all the incentives are there, the potential is great, but we can't take our eye off the ball that in order for that to happen, there are other policies that need to be put in place, namely permitting reform. You mentioned the 10-year window. If it takes 2 years to get guidance and 7 years to get a permit, you don't have much time left. So I just put that out there as a commercial to say, I hope that's not off the agenda either in Congress or at the White House, because it's going to be important for us to achieve everything else we're talking about here. But on the trade side, let me also acknowledge up front, I'm not a trade expert, and thank God I got some real experts back over at the U.S. Chamber. But the chamber, no surprise, free trade is in our DNA, and so and then in many ways, there's not much that unifies the business community more than trying to avoid trade wars. So in this context, but then I think Senator Cramer used the term as weapons and tools, and think of it more, carrots and sticks. What type of policy should we be looking at in the trade space here? And I think clearly when enhancing the climate-related trade diplomacy is going to be really important, and I know senators certainly both recognize that and describe that very well. But looking at what the EU is doing and moving forward, so I have to acknowledge that where they're going, you've got major trading blocks: China, India, developing countries in Africa that are understandably concerned, threatening retaliation. What will that mean? Is how do we avoid moving into something that may become more of a trade war? And I think again, this is an area where, from a chamber standpoint, how do we look at this in a way of carrots versus sticks, rewarding clean products, clean production, more so than punishing those that are less clean. So I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I think that's something just a mindset I think we have to have if we're looking for this more global kind of cooperation to get us to what we've all been talking about here. So, and beyond that, again, senators outlined it very well. We've got to have some policy here that's politically durable, and I'm one that I believe incremental progress is progress. And so let's focus on moving this ball forward. Just as I'd go back to the Energy Act of 2020, it was incremental progress. It was actually one of the biggest climate bills that Congress has passed in 25 years, but it was in the middle of COVID, so nobody really noticed. But it's really had an impact and led to the types of policies we saw in IRA, CHIPS Act.
I think, Katrina, what I see is having the kind of information that the Prove It Act will provide is foundational when you're entering into any bilateral or multilateral talks, any kind of FTA. For those free traders in our audience, if you want a foundation you can use to start to transition away from 232 tariffs, you've got it right here. Because there is an intersectionality between trade policy and climate policy, folks. And once we get that out front, that is backed up by data that everyone can understand, what you're going to see is the ability for us to use our carbon advantage to kind of drive our trade policy. And we can do it in a very laser focused and specific way. If you knew the embodied carbon emissions of, say, every product that was subject to 232, you may find that there's some products that are imported that maybe shouldn't be subject to those tariffs, or maybe should be subject to a tariff that's less than 25%. But we don't have the data to do that. I also think when we look at the global arrangement talks, it's absolutely critical that we have this data, because the EU is kind of taking one approach. It's kind of CBAM based. And if you want to do a deal with us, you need some kind of CBAM in the United States. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon. And we're looking at it from a variety of approaches. Well, let's look at emissions of various steel products. Let's look at excess government-owned capacity. Maybe we need to get rid of that. And I think that's why we haven't seen the type of progress that we thought we would see on the global arrangement, because we don't have comparable emissions data that can serve as that foundation. The EU can kind of say, well, look, this is going to prevent us from getting our CBAM off the ground. And until we can show them our data, they're probably right to say that.
So free trade, particularly amongst allies, remains a really important element of the global economy, right? And I do worry a little bit about there's a sort of a Fortress America political mentality that seems to be creeping in. And there is no doubt that part of that is driven by the fact that our single largest trading partner is increasingly a strategic competitor who plays by rules that make us a little uncomfortable at times. That said, solar is probably a great example. If you look at the manufacturing capacity for solar outside of China right now, we just are not very big. You look at the global demand for solar, it's really big. We could not make enough solar in the US and EU combined to meet this year, next year, probably the year after that. No. 10 years from now, no way. We have to grow really rapidly. We're not going to do that if we try to grow separate from our trading partners. And for example, we make some of the lowest carbon footprint polysilicon in the world here in the US. They make some of the lowest carbon footprint silicon wafers made from that polysilicon in Norway, a little bit of hydro available. And so the really good low carbon solar modules have US made polysilicon, a wafer made in Norway, finishing steps back here in the US. That's a good thing. And a carbon-based metric for trade would enhance and facilitate that. It would create better investment climate for the Norwegians to expand their operations as well as here. That is a good thing. That helps reduce the trade tensions that we might otherwise experience with our trading partners. It also, as I mentioned before, helps send a signal to some of the countries that we would like to be closer to, like India. And we can help them develop their solar industry in a much more carbon sensible way than they currently are. And there's a technology export opportunity for us. So I fundamentally believe that we need to continue to have very open-minded view of trade amongst our allies and be realistic about trade with some of our strategic competitors as well. And the more we can do that with transparent criteria like carbon values, the fewer bumps in the road we'll have in those conversations. You look at some of the trade history we've had in the last administration, it got quite fraught with a number of allies because they perceived many of those actions as not particularly data-driven, shall we say. And that created a lot of strain. I think the more transparent our trade relationships are and the more transparent the criteria that underlie them, the less of that friction we see.
Thanks for the reminder that international supply chains can also help us. lower emission. Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. Sorry, I hogged all the time. Would anybody like to ask a question of our panelists? Otherwise, we'll close with a softball. So you are all very clearly supportive of the Prove It Act. What's your pitch to get more of your industry partners on board in support of this data effort?
I'll go first.
Please,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think one of the pitches for me is we have seen a lot of legislation that is very steel intensive and is going to increase demand for the steel that SMA members make. So I think what the Prove It Act can do is it can also help all of these government agencies that dole out this money better understand how they can make sure that they are buying steel, whether it's the Highway Administration, GSA, Department of Defense, that has the lowest emissions possible. Right now, it's a loose patchwork, and the Federal Highway Administration is taking one approach. GSA has kind of made up something out of thin air called a bifurcated approach. We need to have that data that says this is the lowest emission steel available. Federal government, by the statute, that's the steel you should buy. If you're not sure, look at the Prove It Act, look at the data that it provides. And I think that's the pitch to my members to get behind this so that they're not subject to having one set of standards at GSA and another set of standards at the Highway Administration.
I think for my members, it's not much of a struggle whatsoever, right? They fundamentally, this is a chance to help the market understand competitive advantage that you bring to manufacturing and make the buying decision, because we've gone through, it's a very interesting thing. Clean energy has boomed like crazy. And while it's boomed in a really dirty way on the manufacturing end. And a lot of the buying end of the market was willing to overlook that. Oh, high carbon, well, you know, it's cheap solar panel. Oh, forced labor, well, it's really cheap solar panel. That's starting to change, and people are starting to realize you get, things like the Forced Labor Prevention Act help, but people are starting to realize that model is not really sustainable. And if we're going to quadruple the amount of solar we have in the world in the next 20, 30 years, doing it under that model maybe isn't great. And if we can educate and inform the buying side of the market with data, we've already done it by creating an eco label, but that's a voluntary thing. And even though it was data multi-stakeholder process transparent, it's a industry thing, and that limits its appeal and reach. If the government said, hey, here's the number for this manufacturer, the number for that manufacturer, and you, the better manufacturer, could take that to the buying community and say, guys, there's the difference. What do you think? You want that? You want this? That's a pretty compelling approach to the market. And so my members are all over this because they think it helps them transparently demonstrate an existing and growing advantage.
Three different answers here on a very narrow level. And by the way, as I said, this is a no-brainer as far as our endorsing the bill. But you can't manage what you can't measure. So having this data just from a health standpoint there. Number two, if we're looking to avoid things or avoid the bad side of what may be coming out of the EU or elsewhere, again, this provides market-based opportunities and data that will drive that will allow U.S. Manufacturers and others to take advantage of what we know is a carbon advantage now, and then to go several thousand, 10,000 feet, higher up here. We think about the overall climate space. We're sending have another big delegation going to COP28, and one of the things we've been focused on is to not only elevate and highlight the leadership role the business community has been taking in developing climate solutions and making the investments. It's also a matter of changing a longer term narrative here. I mean, for too long we've had whether it's individual countries or coming out of these conferences every year, announcements are made, agreements are made. But we all know, like, for example, this year we had the global stock take. And guess what? We know what the answer is. We've all failed. right? And I would say in at least in part, the metric was wrong. It was never meant to be a specific metric. Instead, we need to be focusing on is where the business community partnering with governments around the world are making significant investments that will result in the types of emission reductions, technology developments, and partnerships that are necessary, some of which we've heard about here. And this is just another tool, again, to help us identify, where those advantages are and where the U.S. business community can maintain and grow its leadership globally.
Thanks. I want to thank my co-panelists for joining this conversation, for demonstrating why Prove It is important and how helpful it can be in a variety of venues. And I'll turn it back over to you, Greg, to close this out.
Great. Well, thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Marty, Philip, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to answer your question as well. Better data will result in better policy. More bipartisanship will result in a better functioning government. So I hope you will join the senators in their effort to expand the support of the Prove It Act. Second, just a plug for our next event, September 20th. My colleague Matthew Porterfield will be releasing a paper on the WTO implications of the policies that we've been discussing today. Something I know that many of you are very interested in, so stay tuned for that and please tune in. And then finally, I believe we still have many breakfast treats left, so please help yourself to one and join us in the hallway for conversations afterwards so that we can let our good building folks break down this room and get ready for the next event. But one last time, thank you to our panelists, thank you to the senators, their staff. Thank you to